Hello and welcome to today's session where we continue to look at the short fiction written by Aphra Behn in the 17th century, Oroonoko. A quick recap, we took a look at how this is a novel, an early novel which talks about the horrifying effects of slavery. It depicts the horrifying emotions of slavery and colonization. It is also significantly a work written by the first professional female writer, Aphra Behn, and we also spoke about how she led an interesting life. She was a political spy of Charles II's court, and she also had written prolifically. And in spite of that, she died in poverty, and this work, initially when it was published, it was not a bestseller. In fact, it gained immense popularity only after its stage adaptation by Thomas Southern. And ever since, this work has received the attention of scholars and critics for various reasons. One, it talks about the anti-colonial rhetoric even before colonization became a discourse in the Western discursive spheres. And there's no solid proof that seconds the claim that Aphra Behn had visited Suriname, where much of action also takes place in terms of the novel. But nevertheless, there is the text gives us ample evidence to show that she's really familiar with what she's talking about, the setting, the action that she seeks to recreate, and the emotions that she successfully conveys, though novel as a form was still in its infant form when she was writing. So all of this also tells us about the kind of immense experience that she had, the vastness of the wealth of experience that she had, though she was not trained to be a literary writer. She was not trained to be a professional writer. We find her becoming one in the process of leading a very interesting, multifaceted life. There are a lot of works which are credited to Aphra Behn, as we already noted. Some of the important works are The Forced Marriage. So the Rover, which was considered as an important comedy of the Restoration times, it was an instant hit. It was a huge hit to such an extent that it's considered as one of the most successful plays, which generated a lot of revenues during that time. The other significant works includes Patient Fancy, The Lucky Chance, The Emperor of the Moon, and Oroonoko, published in 1688. This was published just a year before her death, and this also ensured her a lasting literary reputation. And this is one work that still continues to be talked about whenever the Restoration times, whenever female writers, whenever Aphra Behn in particular is mentioned in the literary critical tradition. And interestingly enough, it's also important to note that when one talks about Oroonoko, it's also in a way that the work disrupts the tradition, the literary tradition. What Oroonoko perhaps had done to the writings of those times, to the writers of those times, and to the critical tradition of those times, to the prevalent norms of those times, was to entirely disrupt it. So Oroonoko continues to be significant, mostly in that regard, and the text itself may read a bit dated. There are a lot of current interest that one can find in the text even today. I do encourage you to take a look at the text which is currently in circulation to get a hang of the kind of writing that she did, and also to get a hang of the ways in which these very profound themes were built into this narrative. This is the opening section of Oroonoko. This is how this prose fiction begins. I do not pretend in giving you the history of this royal slave to entertain my reader with adventures of a faint hero whose life and fortunes fancy may manage at the poet's pleasure, nor in relating the truth designed to adorn it with any accidents, but such as arrived in earnest to him. And it shall come simply into the world, recommended by its own proper merits and natural intrigues, there being enough of reality to support it, and to render it diverting without the addition of invention. I was myself an eyewitness to a great part of what you will find here set down, and what I could not be witness of, I received from the mouth of the chief actor in this history, the hero himself, who gave us the whole transactions of his youth, and though I shall not omit, for brevity's sake, 1,000 little accidents of his life, which, however pleasant to us, where history was scarce and adventures were rare, yet might prove tedious and heavy to my reader, in a world where he finds diversions for every minute, new and strange. But we who were perfectly charmed with the character of this great man were curious to gather every circumstance of his life. The scene of the last part of his adventures lies in a colony in America called Suriname in the West Indies. So what does this opening section tell us? The opening section tells us that the narrator, the author, wants to present this as an eyewitness account, and that the narrator who is being presented over here had either experienced the events which are being described or had received first hand account. The other significant thing is that it addresses the reader, and that's again an interesting thing to notice. At least twice in this excerpt we find the narrator addressing the reader as my reader. So this is something which is written as a first person account, as an eyewitness account. It is more or less the truth, and it also has a specific reader in mind. It is also being targeted to a reader in the 17th century, and this is something the way in which the novelist, the writer, addresses the reader, that's something we notice in many of the writers later on, and one of the best examples being Jane Austen's oft quoted line, "Reader, I married him." Yeah, coming back to discussing this text, Oroonoko, these are the important characters. Oroonoko himself, who is an African prince, and the way in which Oroonoko is described in the text, the way he looks, the personality, the characteristics, it's very interesting. He is presented as a well-built man with all qualities of a prince. He is good looking, and he is very, very importantly educated by a French tutor. So look at the way in which Oroonoko gets positioned over here. He also has European features. Somewhere in the text it's mentioned his nose was rising and Roman, and his education, his ability to see life through a Western lens, has access to the educational system and ways of looking at the world through the civilization and education systems of the West, that has given him an ability to see through the colonial system, and we find him being very, very wise in that sense. But there's also a change that comes about in his perspective. This is when he begins to he is first presented as someone who admires the Western values, because his education, his background had prepared him to do that, and he also had all the more rational reasons to do it. But the reality hits him hard only when he is taken as a slave. And but nevertheless, but the way in which he is presented here is in quite a significant way away from the prevalent stereotypes of Africans, but on the other hand it also tries to fit Oroonoko into the European framework by his looks, by the way he thinks, and by the kinds of choices that he makes. And we also find that Oroonoko comes across as a very composed, dignified person throughout, and even at the end when he gets killed, he faces death very, very bravely. So here I want you to pay attention to the way in which Oroonoko is presented. Of course, Aphra Behn is a white writer, a white female writer, though she tries to critique the framework of colonialism, though she tries to draw attention to the debates in the context of colonization and anti-colonization. We find that she also chooses to project her protagonist in a predominantly Western framework. And Imoinda is the main female character. She is also the wife of Oroonoko. They had fell in love rather adventurously and had got married. The story tells us all about that. But as a woman and as a slave, she comes across as very, very timid. She's also taken into slavery along with Oroonoko, and all the slaves are generally given a new name. This is to take away the idea of their identity and subjecthood and completely change them into something else. And we find Imoinda not resisting this at all. In fact, with very little resistance, we find her getting adapted to different things that life is throwing at her. And she's given a new name, Clement, which she seems to, not perhaps happily, but she seems to get adjusted to in a very timid way. She is presented as a very beautiful woman, but this is also an obstacle in the story, as we would see. Initially, Oroonoko's grandfather himself wanted to get married to her because of her beauty, and this was always an obstacle. And we find that the men in the colony, they are also getting immensely attracted to her, and this is seen as a threat throughout the story. So she is also presented as a woman without an agency. We do not find her making any decision for herself, thinking for herself, and we find her as an ever-present shadow alongside Oroonoko. But what is also interesting is that Aphra Behn has given adequate presence for her throughout this story, allowing her to allowing us to see her from different perspectives and from different angles. And the only time perhaps Imoinda gets a chance to decide her fate for herself is when she agrees, very gracefully agrees to Oroonoko's proposal of killing her before he also gets killed at the end. And there are certain very beautiful descriptions about the kind of love that they share. The narrator tells us, he made her vows she should be the only woman he would possess while he lived, that no age or wrinkles should incline him to change, for her soul would always be fine, always young, and he should have an eternal idea in his mind of the charms she now bore, and should look into his heart for that idea when he could not find it no longer in her face. So many critics have also spoken about the kind of love story that Oroonoko is, that underneath the profound, powerful, strong satirical discussions about colonization, Aphra Behn has also managed to weave in a beautiful love story, but we shall not be going into the details of those. There are other characters such as Behn, who's Oroonoko's friend, the king, and the colonists, a number of colonists, some of them Bannister, Behn, Treffry, and others. The narrator herself is a nameless English woman. We do not get to know any details about her, just like Aphra Behn's own personal history. She also remains rather obscure. There is very little that is known with certainty about the narrator. When we meet her, she is dwelling on Paham plantation, and she also gives us a detailed overview of Suriname, the plantation, its residents, the surroundings, and those are the details which also makes us believe and rather suspect that perhaps Aphra Behn herself had spent a considerable number of a considerable amount of time in Suriname as a political spy. So at the outset of the story, we also know that the narrator is waiting for a ship to take her back to England, and the narrator is also a white female woman. The narrator is also a white woman, and she meets Oroonoko and his wife Imoinda, and she becomes good friends with them. And the rest of the story, the major part of the story is about the narrator narrating Oroonoko's story, Oroonoko's tale from the time he was a prince and his adventures and his love story and how he became a slave and what happened to him in the colony and finally his death. So apart from that, there's very little that we know about the narrator. But what makes the narrator significant is that the story that's being told to us, it is through the eyes of this narrator, and it also tells us about the perspectives that the narrator has about the various things which are discussed in the story, the main framework being colonization. And for the same reason, one of the most important themes discussed as part of the story is this ongoing debate, the dialogue, and even the hostile relation between colonization and anti-colonization. And it may be useful to remember that this was much before the anti-colonial rhetoric, the discourse on colonialism had become powerful in the West. And as we know, by the 19th and the early 20th century, it also becomes a movement. The colonists, in the story, the colonists, Mr. Treffry, Behn, Bannister, they're all seen as greedy, dishonest, brutal rulers. This goes very much against the grain of the predominant thought that it was a white man's burden which had sent him all the way to these different distant parts of the world. And there is some very touching incidents in the story where Treffry, the British captain, he in fact befriends Oroonoko only to betray him. And his death is also a result of these many betrayals and many complications that happen in the story. The narrator, interestingly, behaves in the same manner as the colonists. She calls herself as a friend of Oroonoko, but she's not there when they need her in that sense. In fact, she also runs away when Oroonoko runs into trouble. And we get a very terrifying picture of slavery. And Oroonoko is beaten up cruelly in one instance. Pepper is put on his wounds. So that's a kind of graphic details that the story gives us, and it also tells us about how brutal the colonists were when it came to getting the work done through the slaves. The slaves were also forced to change their names. So there's a loss of identity, which is a significant theme, and it hits Oroonoko all the more because he was a prince before. And the slaves are also compelled to leave their family and friends behind. And this theme, while it may look very compelling and real today, it is useful to remember that in the 17th century, slaves were seen as a common thing. It was no big deal to use slaves to get work done in the colonies. They were seen as one of the ways in which revenue could be added to the English nation. And it also talks about, in terms of slavery, how the native social system was influenced, how the change had come about. Oroonoko, during his reign as a prince, we find that he also used to sell war captives as slaves, because there was a time in his life when he was reigning as a prince. He also believed that this fate befits men who lose wars, but only when he becomes a slave himself, he begins to realize what that is, and the reality really begins to sink in. And some of the other important themes are of superiority. And when the novel talks about superiority, it is about racial superiority, how the West feels superior in terms of its civilization, the culture, the standards and values. And the premise in this story from the beginning, and this is what we see through the lens of the narrator, that she maintains that there is unity and peace between the British colonists and the natives. That is the perspective of the narrator. But Aphra Behn is also using that efficiently, very powerfully, as a tool to critique the system for what it is, because it really helps to have a narrator who has an opposite point of view, and that also allows Aphra Behn to put the narrator's perspective under the critical lens, and also to showcase it in a more critical way as far as the readers are concerned. So there is an instance in the story where the narrator is reading out to Oroonoko and Imoinda the stories of the lives of Romans and nuns, and that was something which had laid the bedrock, the foundation of the Western civilization, the Western value system. So we find the narrator trying to impart the same kind of standards, the same kind of value system, and also invite Oroonoko and his into this more civilized, sophisticated systems and values. She also tries to explain to him the riddles of Trinity, and we find Christianity also becoming a framework through which this kind of superiority gets exerted and exercised. Throughout this story, it's very hard to miss the different ways in which the racially, or in terms of civilization or culture, standards, values or systems, the West, the Europeans, the English particularly in this case, we find that superiority being presented in multiple ways throughout. As we begin to wrap up, I would also invite you to take a very quick look at the way this story is presented. It is currently accessible in many digital forms, so I do encourage you to take a look at the story and to read through it at least in parts to get a hang of the kind of language used then, and also to see how novel as a form, narrative prose as a form, has come a long way from then. And it also will be a useful exercise to go through the words used and how the form itself is still getting into shape. This is the 17th century, this is the end of the 17th century, when novel as a form, novel as a literary form had not yet taken a definite shape. So with this, we come to the ending of this story, and I read to you this excerpt and leave you with that. Thus died this great man, worthy of a better fate and a more sublime wit than mine to write his praise. Yet I hope the reputation of my pen is considerable enough to make his glorious name to survive to all ages, with that of the brave, the beautiful, and the constant Imoinda. This sums up the objective and the intention of this prose fiction, and it also tells us that the narrator's intention, more than anything, is to document the story of Oroonoko, the African prince who is forced to live as a slave and then gets killed as a slave. And if this had not been documented, the story would have been lost forever. Oroonoko's history would never have got written. And as for me, I think this is the greatest message that a tale such as Oroonoko is sending out. A person like Aphra Behn is trying to send out that it is very important to document everything. It is very important to tell the tales which are otherwise excluded, which are otherwise in the margins, which are otherwise not seen as tales fit enough to be told. And with this, I leave you to read the story. I thank you for listening, and I look forward to seeing you in the next session.